Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these very critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. We've been talking an awful lot about trade, and the overriding question I guess many of us have as we head towards this arbitrary August 1st deadline: must Canada sign this trade deal with the United States, any trade deal with the United States? Is it absolutely imperative that we do so? And the short answer to that, in my opinion, no, it's not. As a matter of fact, the example that I want to use here as a comparator to this is just moments ago, as we're preparing to do the podcast here, came word that the United States and the European Union have agreed on a trade deal. And I use the term trade deal very loosely because it's not a deal at all for anybody. Well, maybe for the United States. But if it's any indication, and I think it is, of the sorts of negotiations, and again, that's a term that probably isn't even applicable here, between the United States and some of these other partners, why should Canada sign? It'd probably be one of the stupidest things we could do. Let's circle back a little bit, and I'll talk to you about the deal that they've got with the European Union, which is rather interesting. This was signed over in Scotland, by the way, and because the president had a short meeting, turned out to be a rather short meeting, with the president of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, over there. And it was really, I think, just to justify the fact that Trump went over there to open one of his old golf courses and use U.S. taxpayers' dollars to do that. But, that's another topic for another day. But that's the way Trump operates anyway. So the EU was under pressure, just like Canada was and a number of other nations, to try to sign this deal because of this arbitrary August 1st deadline. So what did they get after this face-to-face negotiations between the two leaders? Not a whole lot of anything. Let me just run some of these things over to you. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but it's I think, very instructive to understand just what's going on. Trump announced that the European Union is going to hold tariffs and be paying tariffs of 15%, ending what had been months of uncertainty. Now, don't forget that initially Trump had threatened 30% tariffs with the European Union. Then he dropped it down to 20%. So it's 15%. So it sounds like a win for the European Union, right? Wrong. Not at all. The European Union did pay tariffs previously of 1.5%. 1.5%. Now it's going to be 15%. That's not a deal by any stretch of the imagination. Now, they try to, candy coat this whole thing and say, well, this is going to offer some stability now between Canada and the European Union and the number of countries that are involved in that. And there's a point to be made there. I get that. But at what cost? I get the idea, the overriding view here that, if there's stability in the economic markets around the world, that's good for everybody, including Canada, even though they're not directly involved in this. But look at the price that these people are going to pay for this. And I'm talking about the members of the European Union. You go down the list here and you talk about, what they're going to be giving up or what they're going to be getting. Trump went on to say here that the EU is going to agree to purchase from the United States $750 billion worth of energy. They're also going to buy from the United States what was termed as a vast amount of military equipment. They haven't actually defined that number, but basically they're going to say, hey, you're going to get it from us. That's the way it's going to come down to. And Trump was saying, well, this is essential because, he says, because of these tough negotiations, trade with the European Union had essentially been shut down. Well, that's not true. Absolutely not true. In 2024, the value of goods from the United States that went into the European Union was estimated to be $400 billion. So they were doing very well, thank you very much, and so was the United States, until Trump came along and simply said, we're going to play by my rules. And that's all there is to it. And there's no justification for it. But the EU, just like Japan previously, and the UK before that, basically feel as if they've got a gun to their head and they have to sign something here because they're afraid of the retribution of what Trump might do to them with 50% tariffs and some of the other threats that he's made. And we're in the same boat here in Canada. That's why I'm glad that we have not signed any sort of a deal or come to some sort of agreement, because this is the sort of stuff that the United States is calling an agreement. It's not fair to both sides. It's heavily weighted towards the Americans, and the other people are simply, it's basically a situation where, they figure it could only get worse if we don't sign something. But it's a bad deal for the European Union. It was a bad deal for Japan. It was a bad deal for the UK. And if we sign on, it's going to be a bad deal for Canada. And we have to understand that. And I've seen, and I'm sure you have too, over the last couple of days, some of the pundits, some of the so-called quote unquote, media experts or political experts writing in, some of the National Post and the Sun newspaper chains, criticizing Carney, elbows aren't up anymore. What do you expect him to do? For a negotiation to be had and for a deal to be made, it takes two sides to come together to try to find some common agreement. Well, that's not happening. Trump is simply imposing his will on these quote-unquote partners of his and simply saying, it's this or nothing. That's all there is to it, and we'll just tariff the crap out of you from here on in. It's a threat, and they're falling for the threat. And I get where they're coming from, because it could get pretty ugly for the next little while. But I don't think, and I hope that our trading representatives, Dominic LeBlanc and the Prime Minister himself and others, don't fall for this gag and simply say, well, we better give in because we're really going to get screwed around here. You're going to get screwed around anyway. These are not deals. The whole thing about negotiation is supposed to be give and take. And the Canadian example, I think that we've talked about in past podcasts, I think comes to light here. Trump has ranted and raved about our supply management with our Canadian dairy industry. And a number of those experts are starting to speak up on the American side of the border now and saying, we're the victims here. Canada's screwing us around. Well, that's crap. There are quotas in place, but they were agreed to quotas. I mean, the Americans and the Canadians signed off on this. And as we've reminded you many, many times, and when they signed this revised deal, this CUMSA deal, Trump called it the greatest trade deal of all time. He signed off on it. These were his people that negotiated this. So now the industry is saying, well, we want more. We want a bigger piece and more access to the Canadian market. So Trump is simply reneging on his commitment to that trade deal, as he has with other tariffs. The tariffs on steel and aluminum and copper, the peril that he's putting the Canadian auto industry into is all generated by Trump. These things were all talked about, and there were some compromises made, in those previous deals, and we were living with those, and okay, we're going to renegotiate it at some point, and maybe we can tweak this and tweak that. Trump is basically saying, I don't want to do this anymore. And there's an interesting political side to this, but there's an even more interesting legal side to this, because according to the U.S. Constitution, he's not allowed to do this. He does not have the authority to do this. And that's being challenged now. And that's an interesting sidebar issue to the fact that, we're closing in on our deadline on October 1st, or August 1st, rather, as to whether or not we're going to find a deal. But there are a number of people south of the border that are not pleased with what Trump is doing, too. The U.S. Court of International Trade, U.S. Court, that is, of International Trade, ruled back in May that Donald Trump does not have the authority to wield tariffs on nearly every country through the International Economic Emergency Powers Act of 1977. That's what he keeps quoting, and said, I have the right to do that and the ability to do that because there's a crisis. Well, there is no crisis. There is no economic crisis except for the one that he's created. There is no fentanyl crisis at the Canadian border. There are no numbers that indicate that's even close. The numbers that we have quoted to you in previous podcasts, about less than 1% of the fentanyl heading into the States comes from Canada. Those are U.S. numbers. Those are from the U.S. authorities. We're not making that up. That's his own enforcement agencies that are giving us those numbers. But Trump all of a sudden says, no, it's much higher than that. And the problem here that the Americans are dealing with right now, and that, of course, it falls down on us, and we're the ones that have to pay the price for this, is this could have stopped day one if the U.S. Congress had simply stood up and say, hey, no, Mr. President, you can't do that. That's our job. Don't step on our toes. Don't mow our lawn, whatever metaphor you want to use here. But they're spineless, of course, in the Congress, and even more so in the Senate. And they're just sycophants for whatever Trump wants, so he gets away with it. There are some people, though, that are challenging this in the court, and that hearing is expected by later on this week, which is going to be very interesting. Now, the cynic in me will suggest that even if they were to win that court case and Trump was ruled to be way off base on this, he's simply going to take it to the Supreme Court, ultimately, and he'll win there because he stacked the court with his own people. And so he's going to win no matter what happens here. So you can't look at this and hang your hat on this and say, hey, we can just drag the puck here and wait until that court decision comes down, and then we can move in there in Canada with our negotiators and get ourselves a better deal. This is ugly, and it's going to stay ugly for the longest time. But what we need to understand here is to put this in perspective. So before you start slapping Carney around and his negotiating team and say, they're just not getting the job done, this is what they're faced with. This is what's being put on the table by the U.S. negotiators. And it's crap. And there's no way we should sign on to this. And I know that no deal means that he arbitrarily do whatever he wants and jack tariffs up. But you and I both know that even if we signed a deal, he would do that anyway. This is the whimsy of Donald Trump. You can't trust him at his word. So, I mean, we're really backed into a corner here. And I would suggest that what Carney and his team are doing right now is probably the best course of action. It's not going to be easy, but the reality is, in this particular case, as the Prime Minister told us a couple of weeks ago, given who we're dealing with and given the crazy attitude that Trump seems to have here and the fact that the guy can't be trusted, his word means nothing, no deal for Canada is much better than a crappy deal. We have to remember that. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. And if you're new, hey, great to have you with us. Pick us up on any one of the platforms where you get your podcast. And you'll notice that we also include, of course, lots of further reading materials when we drop these podcasts, so you can give some context to what you're doing. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. And there's lots more to talk about with some of these trade issues, and we'll be doing that on future podcasts. In the meantime, I'm Bill Kelly. In the meantime, before we do this again, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.